This is Laurie Moore-Moore with another Texas Brave and Strong podcast. Today's podcast is part 2, featuring a special guest, and the topic is bushcraft. For those of you who have listened before, you know that bushcraft is all about the skills we need to survive in the great and sometimes challenging outdoors. Survival skills, the skills our ancestors had moving west and settling the frontier. So let's turn again to my guest, Harley Retherford, a young man from the beautiful Ozark Mountains in northeastern Oklahoma. Not far from the main trail pioneers traveled to the Red River through Indian Territory and into Texas. Harley practices bushcraft for pleasure, and he has some more tips to share with us. So, Harley, thanks again for being back on Texas Brave and Strong. Let's jump in with some more bushcraft ideas. All right, so we've dealt with water. Let's come back to food. What about food? Where do you get food when you're out there in the great outdoors? And I know it's going to vary based on the kind of country that you're traversing.
Well, a lot of people would assume hunting, and while hunting, you can get a deer or another large animal. How long is that going to last you, and how long is it going to take you to get another one? It's not an effective method of gathering food. Instead, fishing and trapping would be your primary ways of gathering flesh to eat, largely because in hunting, you are in one place at one time, and that time is spent where you cannot get it back, and if you don't get anything, you're out of 6 hours. In trapping, you go out for an hour and set 30 traps, come back at the end of the day or the next morning, you check your traps, and you might have 10 or so catches. And that's food that you have available right there. And again, you can set more than one in different places, so you're not restricted to essentially being in one place at one time.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say trap, again, since we're so limited with what we can carry, are we talking about snares?
Snares would be easy to make. There is another old Indian trap that I learned about. It requires what is considered an engine called a windlass. A windlass is where you take two trees that are growing close to each other and tie a rope around them or twine relatively tight, and you put a spiked stick in it and twist it backwards. And then you merely make a trigger. I prefer an L7 trigger myself, that whenever an animal triggers it, that spike will fling around and strike right behind where the trigger is positioned. It is easy to make and relatively effective if you like to get a little bit more fanciful with your traps. However, a snare will work perfectly fine, and it's just about the quickest and easiest trap you can set.
Now, if you're setting snares, I assume you need some sort of cording or twine, and if you're setting a lot of snares, you need a lot of that. Is there a way to make your own?
Yes, you can make cording out of leathers by braiding leather. You can make cording out of bark, the inside bark of a tree, by scraping the outside off, cutting long strips of about a 1/4 inch wide or so of that inside bark and twisting it. And once you have that twisted, you twist 3 or more strands together to make a cord. And you can alternate the positions of them, so you might fold one 3-foot strand in half and then link one 3-foot strand in the end of that and twist that together, where later on you can put 2 strands together. That way your strands don't end at the same time, and you can continue extending your twine by adding more and more strands as you twist down the length.
Okay. So if you set your snares at night and you're traveling and you set your snares at night and you get up in the morning and check your snares, you haven't wasted time hunting.
No.
And hopefully you've made some catches. Now, what about fishing?
Fishing is another one of those old technologies that, whilst there are a lot of advancements to fishing nowadays, at its core has not changed a lot at all. And Fishing is relatively effective because if you know what you're doing, you can catch 20 fish in 2 or 3 hours. And that can be enough food to sustain you for a day or two. Another way is, like trapping, you can set traps in water, whether that be trot lines, whether that be, I've seen these little cages that you make where a fish will swim in, and the hole to get in is small enough that they can't find it, and it makes it harder for them to escape. And you can make these by literally gathering up twigs and stabbing them into the soft ground of a riverbed.
Okay. And fish would be, I would think, a key food if you have the ability to fish successfully because it has so much oil in it. And fat is one of the things that is critical in terms of our diet. And,
Absolutely.
So fish could be a key part of your diet. I want to jump back to something you said a minute ago about taking the bark off of a tree, carving off the hard part and leaving the softer lining of the bark. You were talking about using it to make cording, but there's something called tree bacon that also comes from inside that bark. What's that about?
So, tree bacon, there are certain trees that the inside lining of that bark you can fry and eat. It's not very tasteful, but it has enough substance in it to sustain you. You won't be thriving. You won't feel terribly good because you'll still be a little hungry, but it'll keep you going for as long as you need it to until you can get, some actual food. And so in an emergency, tree bacon is what you got to do.
So it's not exactly hickory smoked bacon, huh?
No, it's not. If it were, it would be a lot better.
What about foraging? What about looking and gathering things that Mother Nature provides? Berries. I saw something recently on one of the survival shows where the survivor actually saw a squirrel's cache of mushrooms. The squirrel apparently had gathered all these mushrooms, lined them up on a tree branch to dry, and the survivor came along and scooped them up, and I assume quickly gobbled them up. Looking for things like that, are there found things like berries and squirrel's mushrooms and mushrooms in the ground? What other things might one look for if you're knowledgeable?
Well, talking about squirrels' caches, nuts. Acorns are edible. I know that they can become toxic, but if you find a cache of squirrel nuts, of acorns, you could look through them and pillage them and have a decent supply of acorns that might be able to hold you over. In fact, a lot of people, you would have to have a homestead or something, but a lot of people in the old days would make flour from acorn. And so many people think acorns are not edible. They are, in fact, edible.
Yeah, I've heard of people making some kind of coffee, even a coffee substitute from various nuts and acorns. I'm not sure it would win any awards, but
Well,
something to drink, I guess.
yes, for coffee, there's actually I believe it's dandelion roots. You can bake and create coffee from it, and it's supposed to have a slightly chocolate and nutty flavor.
Yeah, that sounds better to me than acorn, I think. I much prefer the sound of that. All right, well, let's stop for a moment and kind of see where we are here. We've talked a little bit about shelter. We'll come back and talk about different kinds of shelter. Shelter, fire, a bit about food, water. You mentioned safety. Talk to me a little bit about that. I assume people want to travel safely, but you've put it way up there as one of the primary things to think about.
Well, even nowadays, we have society all around us. There's a hauler in front of my house, maybe 400 feet away, and it might be 250, 300 feet deep. I lose service about a quarter way down. If I fall and break my leg and end up in the bottom of that hauler, I'm at the mercy of nature. Even worse, if you're in the wilderness back in those days, you have to be incredibly careful with everything you do. A small cut can be life or death. If that cut is from a toxic plant, or even if it's from a plant that an animal has defecated on and it has some form of disease. It could be a very critical injury, and you have to be able to protect yourself from that, whether by having proper bandaging, cleaning supplies. In that days, it would largely be waters and alcohols. If you have alcohols, however, you could make tonics and salves. They are herbs that have effects on the human body that, help fight certain diseases, help you recover certain things, and how you make a tonic is much how you make an extract. You have a container that you fill with an alcohol, usually a relatively strong alcohol, and put in these herbs and let it soak for about a month. And at the end of that month, that will have pulled the nutrients and everything out of those plants. And then you can pull the plants. I would suggest leaving them in there just so it'll get stronger. And whenever it's needed, it can be drunk because alcohol is a natural preservative. A solve is much the same, save for the fact that your plant is the higher in volume than the alcohol. And the alcohol is largely just as a preservative that you can, I assume some of it might be consumed, but largely I believe it is used to rub onto a deep gash or something like that to help fight against infection or even just prevent infection.
Mm-hmm. So pioneers, once they were settled, would probably make, as you say, tonics and creams or salves, and that would be medicine that they could at least acquire easily, although they have to make it themselves. Where would the alcohol come from?
Well, farmers in that old day, they had very limited storage supply. And so if they grow too much, which was common, where they can't store it, you have a set amount of grains or other produce that's going to go bad. And so you have to make use of it somehow, else you're just at a loss. So they would largely make alcohols with the excess that they had, that they didn't sell or that they couldn't store. And that's why alcohol is such a big industry, and a large amount of the world is because worldwide farmers made alcohol to keep from losing their produce. So at least they had something that they could store and keep from that.
Okay, interesting. And I suppose some of it they actually just drank.
Yes, very likely.
More than likely. All right, so we've covered shelter, fire, food, water, safety. The other thing you mentioned was comfort. Now, why is comfort on the list?
Well, comfort is very, very important. To be frank, if you don't have the drive to continue on, you're not going to continue on. And you're not going to have the drive if you're not comfortable. If you're miserable, if day in and day out you're miserable, you're not going to care about staying alive. You're not going to care enough about yourself to keep yourself healthy, to feed yourself, to make sure you have clean water, to, if you get cut or injured, to properly bandage and take care of that injury. You're not even going to have enough care to really take care of your own food. And so with comfort comes the ability to tend to yourself, to ensure that you will continue on, to keep that drive that I don't care what happens, I'm going to press on. And if you're not comfortable, it's going to be a whole lot harder to keep that drive.
Wow. That makes comfort really important. I can understand why it's on the list now. Well, tell me about something that would make you more comfortable as you travel.
Well, whenever you're traveling, you have to find a place to stop and sleep. If you just lay on the flat ground or on the ground anywhere, the ground will actually leach heat from your body. You'll lose heat by sleeping. So you can do several things to make yourself more comfortable. One of the easiest is to build a debris bed. You pile up leaves and pine needles and such, maybe dead grass, to about 12 inches tall. Whenever you put your bedroll on it and lay down, it'll be a cushion from the hard ground, and it will be an insulator that will compress to about 4 inches and keep the ground from leaching that heat from your body, making you even more comfortable. You can do little things like that. Even if you find, whenever you're cooking, find garlic, onion, and throw that into your meal. Little things like that will make you more comfortable. Enjoying your food will make you comfortable. And you'll essentially be like, hey, I want to have that again. I'm going to live tomorrow to eat that again.
All right. Well, what if it's cold? Is there anything you can do to make sure you do stay warm? Obviously the shelter will make a difference, but anything else that you might be able to do? Do you stay close to the fire? Do you use the fire in some way to warm yourself while you're in bed?
Yes, you can. You can dig a hole, a long hole, usually, about the size of your bedroll, and you'll build your fire in that hole. It needs to be deep enough that you can bury the coals of the fire under about 12 inches of dirt. You let your fire burn all day. You stalk it and get it along pretty well the hole, and you spread your coals out at the end of the day. Then you bury it, and you lay your bedroll down on it. And those coals will smolder under there pretty well all night long. And the heat will rise up through your bedroll into your body and help you stay warm throughout the night. And you can frankly do that every night if you have the time to dig your hole. If you're not in rocky ground, it's not going to take you very long at all.
Okay, let me make sure I understand that. So what you do is you take the hot coals from your fire. You would put them in a hole running, say, the length of your body about, and you would have that covered with about a foot of dirt, and then you could put your tarp down or your leather down and sleep on that. Maybe even adding some leaves. Would you add some leaves to that, or would that
I would not.
Okay, it might be too warm, huh?
No, it would actually be colder.
Oh, okay.
Because the leaves and grass act as an insulator to keep your body from losing heat to the ground, just the same as they will act an insulator from keeping those coals under the ground from giving your body heat.
Ah, that makes sense.
So you want just enough separation between you and the coals that you don't get burned, and virtually no insulation. You want it to be comfortable with enough padding, and if you have a few leathers, I would throw them down to give yourself a little bit of padding and make it comfortable. You could also do simple things like pick out the rocks whenever you dig your hole. That'll make the ground and the dirt a lot softer. It'll be loose dirt whenever you pile it on there, and it's going to be relatively soft.
Okay. All right. So I get it. I get the whole idea of looking for small ways that give you some comfort, and that's going to help keep you motivated to continue your travel, because you're going to encounter, I'm sure, all kinds of difficulties
Oh, yes.
along the way. What about knots? We talked about making snares. We're going to talk in a minute about building shelters, and I'm sure that's going to involve tying some knots. What do we need to know about knots?
Well, knots are fairly hard to explain to someone with just words, but I can say this. There are some very simple knots that are very easy to learn, and you want to have as few knots as you can for as many jobs as you want. My favorite are slip knots, just a standard shoelace knot, and a half hitch, because they have worked for everything I need them to do. They will do virtually anything you need, and that is only 3 knots for hundreds of different jobs. If you had 100 knots for 100 jobs, you would have to carry around a heavy book to keep track of which knot to use here, how to tie this knot, where to put it, and everything like that.
Okay. I think I may have thought of something that illustrates both safety and comfort. And it's something you mentioned as maybe something that should go on the list of important things to have with you. And that's good boots.
Absolutely. As I was talking about, you get cut by a plant that is either inherently toxic or has some form of substance on it, that defecation, like I'd said earlier, or perhaps even a toxic fruit or something fell and skewered that plant, whatever it may be. If you step on a thorn and your boots aren't good enough, your shoes aren't good enough, it's going to pierce into the bottom of your foot. And if it's got some form of corruption on it, or it is inherently toxic, you're going to have a hard time getting around and even just taking care of yourself while your foot's swelling up the size of, a watermelon.
That's not good, whether you're walking or riding.
No. And so a good pair of boots and even just good clothing, not only that it can protect you, but again, is comfortable. You don't want something that you hate to walk around in. You don't want something that hurts your feet, but you want it to be protective enough on the sole of your foot, and you want it to have good ankle support in case you step on the side of a rock, and it'll keep you from rolling your ankle as bad, and you can still continue on. There's another thing with safety, going back to that right quick. Watch where you step. Like I said, falling down a holler and breaking my leg, if I'm not being careful where I step, that's a lot more likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's jump into what's a pretty big topic, but a very important topic. It's big in terms of importance as well as in content. Shelters. What can you tell us about the kinds of shelters that might be options for you if you're in the outdoors and need to spend the night?
Well, there are many, many, many types of shelters. One of my favorite, because it is very easy and it does use the tarp or an oilcloth or leathers, would be a plow point shelter. It's very simple to do. You attach one corner of a square or rectangle tarp to a tree about head or chest height. And you don't have to have it attached directly to the tree. You can have it strung out, by a rope or something, several feet away from the tree. That one corner is suspended in the air, and you pull the other three corners tight to the ground, spreading it out almost like an arrowhead, and stake it down. That way, you have that corner, the far corner, away from the tree, facing towards the direction the wind is coming from. So the wind will split along the top of that and away from you. You can sleep in that with virtually no wind as long as staked down well. And regardless of how stormy it is or windy it is, that wind will not steal your heat because, again, it's going on either side of you and never touching you.
Okay, that sounds like something even I could build.
It is super simple and super useful.
All right, how about another?
Well, there's more of a tent configuration, and you can do this many other ways. It would take a square or rectangle tarp, which, from what I have seen and experienced, are the most common, and even in those days, probably the easiest to build. And you could either string a rope between two trees and lay your tarp over that and stake down the four corners, or you could even just carry two sticks or cut a couple sticks or branches, whatever you want to call them, 4 foot tall, and use them to suspend two edges and stake the corners again, stretching the tent, and you have a tent.
Now that sounds like the tent that I used to build as a child using my mother's clothesline and an old quilt.
Yes, very similar. What would be helpful if it was a little windy is to pull your posts in a little bit. That way you can fold your edges together and close the seam. That way you don't have air passing through. Mm-hmm. But if it's not super windy, that'll protect you from the basic elements, and it's a pretty good little shelter.
Mm-hmm. All right, sounds like it would be. What about a really simple one-night shelter that might also have an aspect of making you not real visible? In other words, something that hides you a bit. If you're concerned about where you are and who might be out there, and you want to be able to sleep, but be safe while you're doing it?
Well, there is a shelter I've seen, and I've kind of slept under one. I haven't ever done it rightly proper, but I've done a makeshift one. And that is to have two logs side by side that you stretch your tarp over where it's just high enough that you can weasel your way under it with your bedroll and close off the ends. And there's pretty much just enough room for you and a little bit of air. It'll trap your oxygen in the or your heat rather, sorry, in the little room you've made. And if you're hiding, you can pile debris on it and make it look like it's just a pile of logs or a tree that's fallen that's had debris piled up against it. And that is another one that I actually wanted to talk about is called a debris shelter. And that is more visible, but again, very camouflaged. And that would be find a fallen tree that's at an angle and pile up sticks and branches like a tent, and then pile debris and pack debris against it where it looks, again, like a tree that's fallen and has a bunch of debris piled up against it, which really is what it is. You just did it yourself instead of letting nature take its course. And it'll protect you just the same.
All right. What have we not talked about with regard to bushcraft techniques that might have been used 100 years or more ago?
Well, bushcraft is one of those things that has been around for a long time, even if it didn't have the name bushcraft. It's one of those things that has developed over centuries. There's never enough time to learn all of it. And so, let's see.
We've covered a lot. I just don't want to leave anything that you think might be critically important.
I'm trying to think, but my mind's drawing a blank right now.
Okay, no worries.
And that's like I was saying, I do this for a hobby. I'm not an expert. And so there's going to be things that some experts might think, hey, that's real simple, and I've never heard of it.
Well, I think we've covered a tremendous amount, and I don't know, Harley, but I feel like if all of a sudden I found myself in the woods, I at least have some basic ideas of what might be critical to survival and a few techniques to try to implement to ensure that, I live to travel another day. And I really want to thank you. It's been interesting, and I think some people have learned the definition of the word holler. And and I had to laugh before the show. Harley told me he's used holler all his life as a term, and it's a common term in northeastern Oklahoma. And I guess that's true in Texas from the sense of arroyo. I'm sure if we were talking to somebody from the Northeast, they'd say, "Aurora what?"
Yes, ma'am.
It's funny how terms change from one part of the country to another. Well, my guest for this episode on bushcraft has been Harley Retherford. Harley, I want to thank you so much for some real insight into bushcraft, and would love to visit with you some more, both on and off air, about the skills that are important. And I want to remind everybody, this has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. We air every other week. Thanks for tuning in. Y'all come back.